ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Hello, Richard here, bringing you some of the most memorable guests we've had on nearly 20 years of conversations. And this time it's the story of Gregory Smith. For a long time, Gregory Smith was that guy you sometimes see on the streets, sleeping rough, alone, looking a bit ragged, and maybe a little bit scary too. Gregory had survived an unusually cruel childhood and found he could never quite get going in life, with no way of fitting in or keeping in work. Then, in 1990, Gregory entered a forest in northern New South Wales, and he lived there, isolated and alone, for a decade. And when he came out of the forest, he decided to study. He completed a degree while he was still homeless. Now he's an academic at Southern Cross University. He has a home and he has people in his life. But he has had that life, which many of us fantasize about in an idle moment, of living completely off the grid, in complete solitude, in an intensely beautiful place. Hi, Gregory.
Hello, Richard.
Tell me about going into the forest. How did you find your way in there?
I think the forest found me, to be completely truthful, Richard. I had nowhere else to go. It was pretty much the end of the road for me. I'd given up on society. Society had pretty much given up on me. The appeal of the forest was more comfortable than the appeal of sleeping another night in a park or somewhere that I was vulnerable. It gave me a lot more freedom just to be okay with who I was at the time.
How did you find your way to the spot where you wanted to stop and settle?
Well, the first day I was in the forest, it rained. And then it rained some more. And then it rained some more. And then it rained a lot. I became aware very quickly that I needed somewhere that was going to be reasonably well drained, because during that first day I accumulated a lot of leeches, some ticks and a lot of other things that weren't necessarily welcome on my being. So the next day I set off and I looked for a little spot that was high, close to a running little creek, and I found some nice lava rock.
What was the forest like? Can you paint a picture of that place?
Oh, it was very beautiful. Bangalow palms, there were lots of little streamlets and little creeks running through, and I mean the water was so crystal clear you could look down and see the big blue crayfish sitting on the bottom, which I never ate. I could never come to eating them.
Why not?
Oh, they were too beautiful. And I was also aware that they were a vulnerable species, so they were off the menu.
What did you bring in with you?
I had a pouch of tobacco, a box of matches, some clothes, and a dry as a bone raincoat. It came in very handy in those early days.
What kind of shelter did you build for yourself?
Initially, it was the dry as a bone raincoat over a couple of pieces of timber. That changed and evolved, and after a couple of months I realised that I could build a reasonably solid lean-to. I needed to get myself off the ground to sleep. Sleeping on the lava rock was causing me a few inconveniences.
What kind of inconveniences? I'm smelling a bit of understatement here.
It was close to snakes.
Yes, snakes are so inconvenient.
Ticks, leeches, just the creepy crawlies that you find in the forest. So it was reasonably important. I mean, one night, a couple of weeks in, I was asleep and I was under the dry as a bone. I hadn't really established a good sleeping arrangement, and I could feel something. I could feel something going across me, and I froze. I just froze solid. And my reality kicked in, and I knew it was a snake. So I didn't move, and it took its time. I was certainly in no rush, but it just sort of went across and over me. And when I felt it leave, I very cautiously got up and I went over to the fire and I grabbed a fiery ember and I'm looking for it. It was about a 5.5 foot python. And a big sigh of relief, it was a python.
All right, not a poisonous snake.
Well, that's right. It wasn't going to eat me, so...
What were your days filled with in that spot?
It's amazing how you fill your day up. One of the beautiful things is I wake very early, and the birds, it's very loud in a forest. Very, very loud.
Dawn chorus wakes you up.
Absolutely. And the symphony, just that symphony, it's magic. If I had food, I would eat. If I didn't, I'd try and go and find some. Then, after a period of time, it was about getting fresh foliage for my bed, just checking the lean-to, check everything was okay there, just in case it rained. Getting firewood. As much as possible, I never let the fire go out. But at the same time, it was important not to have too much smoke coming out of the fire because the smoke was traceable, and it was important not to be located.
What were you eating?
Whatever I could catch, apart from snake. I ate snake once, but I had nightmares. I had nightmares for weeks after I ate the snake. Bats, flying foxes, grubs.
How would you catch the flying foxes or bats?
I had a Shanghai. I made a Shanghai.
Or just ping them with a rock?
Yeah. Yeah, well, it takes a lot of practice. I wasn't always good at it. I might get 1 out of 15 shots.
And once you catch them, how would you prepare it?
Well, long time ago, I knew this guy called Gussie Nichols, and he told me that the best way to eat a flying fox is you throw it in the fire just the way it is.
Right.
Yeah. You just keep turning it, and that's what I did.
And what was your preferred type of food out there?
My preferred food was rice, if I could get it. Over time, I'd established a trade network with some of the fringe dwellers. I would trade items for a little bit of this and that, tobacco, rice, flour, powdered milk.
Did you have a preferred snack out of the food that was available for you in the wild?
Probably the flying fox was the nicest, if it was cooked properly, yeah.
How about insects?
Yeah, they could be a bit tangy, some of the insects.
Tangy?
Tangy, yeah. Some are bitter. I mean, there were a lot of grubs, a lot of like witchetty grubs and things like that. I think the worst thing I ate were the worms.
What kind of... Oh, like those really big ones?
Those really big worms, yeah.
And do you cook those or just eat them as is?
No, I just ate them as is. I'd take them down the creek, I'd wash them and try and get all the dirt out of them. But they served a purpose.
I suppose you're looking to balance your diet, aren't you, with protein and carbohydrates and a bit of fat?
I never tried to balance my diet. I was, if I could find it, I'd eat it.
Would you know what you were missing just by what you were hungering for?
On occasions, yeah, I would. Sometimes I had cravings for red or green. Yeah, for sure. What
was going on? Was this a romantic idea? You living in the wild at the time? Did it feel romantic to you?
On occasions. For example, there were mornings when I woke up and where I was on the lava rock, I could walk about 15 metres down to the edge of this great gorge, and it was massive. I could look across the gorge and there were waterfalls on the other side, and you could see the waterfalls. Sometimes early of a morning I walk down there and the gorge is full of cloud. It looks like you could walk across. I could see the other side as clear as anything. Sometimes I actually had to stop myself from doing it. It was just an incredibly beautiful experience.
How comfortable did the local animals get with your presence there?
Some very comfortable. I never tried to make pets of them. One of the interesting things was that I learned the mammal or marsupials and reptiles even had regular patterns, and I'd see goannas. I had a couple of little ones, but there were a few big ones there as well. I could never catch them. I was a bit worried about them.
Would they ignore you after a while, some of these animals?
Well, some of the goannas were curious, I think. Yeah, a lot would ignore me. Yeah, they just go and do their business.
How did you keep track of time in the forest?
Oh, that was pretty easy. Yeah, the sun came up of a morning and went down of a night, and that was about it. On the occasion that I did venture out of the forest, one of the first questions I would ask somebody is, what month is it? And this was often followed by, which year?
Were you sometimes surprised by the answer?
I had no expectations. I really didn't. Sometimes I'd go 6-8 weeks without speaking to someone.
Now, you were making moonshine there while you're in the forest, weren't you? How would you do that? How did you build a still?
It wasn't so much moonshine, but you had to have something worthwhile trading. So, I mean, it's the basic essence of survival. It's trade. It was more of a wart than a still, and I was making green beer, basically. So...
how would you do that?
Well, after a period of time, I made a couple of little trades for trinkets and for a few dollars here and there, and then I went into town one day and I bought myself a big those plastic garbage cans, some yeast and some sugar and a few other things, and made some beer. That didn't work out all that well. It tasted really, really foul, really, really foul. But it had enough kick to it to be effective.
So it tasted foul, but it worked.
It worked. And some of the fringe dwellers on the edge of the forest, they were willing to trade me for it. So I could trade some tobacco and a few dollars here and there for what I needed.
Most of the time, it sounds like your presence was pretty imperceptible in the forest. But one day you found a note. Tell me about that.
I was coming in through one of the entrails of where I was, and there was a note. I spotted this piece of paper under a rock. And curiosity got the better of me. I went and picked it up and I had a look at it. My reading wasn't all that good, but it basically said, "You've been in here for some time now. If you would like somewhere rent-free to live, I have a place on my property. It's the first gate on the left as you go down the road. Please consider."
What did you think when you read that?
I didn't think much, actually. I guess I wasn't sure it was for me, to be honest.
Was it an attractive proposition after having lived in the forest all that time to go and live in a house?
I did think about it. Well, it wasn't a house, it was a caravan apparently. But I did think about it, and then I thought, well, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be obligated to anyone. I don't want to be associated with anybody. I really value my isolation, my independence. I value my way of life at the moment.
How were you seen by people in the area when they spoke about you?
Oh, that came out a few years later when I was asking someone about the note. And they said to me, "You know why that person wanted you to go and live on your property?" And I said, "No." They said, "Because you have this reputation of being the wild man in the forest. You're really scary." And he figured that if you came and lived on his property, nobody had come near his place. So I was the guard dog.
There I was thinking, what a kind Samaritan it is. But, perhaps there was some kindness there as well. Nonetheless,
I'm sure there was.
Yes.
I'm sure there was.
Do you think you were that at the time a little scary to people at that point?
Well, on reflection, yeah. I guess people can be afraid of what they don't know. And at that time, I had really long hair and a big beard and totally unkempt. I mean, there was a nice creek there, but I never bathed in it. It wasn't something... my well-being wasn't my primary concern. I guess the longer I stayed in the forest, the more unhealthy I became.
What were you trying to process in that period? Were you trying to purge something from your system?
On reflection, yes. I don't think I understood that at that time. Today I say I went into the forest with myself, for myself, by myself. And the whole idea of that was to try and understand what was wrong. And I call a part of that process that went on in the forest the decatholicization of who I was, because I'd spent so much time in a Catholic orphanage and, I was riddled with guilt and shame and fear. that I couldn't function, and that was a part of that problem with not being able to connect with society.
So Gregory, you were born in Tamworth in New South Wales, and you were sent to an orphanage at the age of 10. Why were you sent there?
Well, I'm a product of a dysfunctional family, a very violent, dysfunctional family. My father was an alcoholic. He abused the family.
Kids as well as your mother?
No one escaped. My mother, she didn't help. She tormented him, teased him. She would antagonise him as well. She had extramarital relationships as well.
But was anyone keeping an eye on you and your sisters?
Not at all. It wasn't a period where children were a priority, where children were taken care of at that level.
How did you learn to protect yourself in that situation where violence could break out at any moment?
Always sit near a door, a window. If there was a big stick around, like a broomstick or something, that was even better.
What, to defend yourself?
Absolutely.
I hear that you never quite lose those habits, do you? Even now, do you kind of scan a room when you walk into it?
Well, I can tell you that I went for a walk out in the surroundings here before I came in, and I can tell you now where every surveillance camera is. I can tell you where each of the trails. It's just one wander through there, and I get a very good picture of what's going on.
Once you see a kind of an avenue of escape, does that make you feel a bit better?
Yes, it does. Yeah, even today it does.
When you went into the orphanage, did you think you'd been totally abandoned, or did you expect to be taken back at some time?
I was so angry at the time because I was treated like a child is treated at the time. I was never told what was going on. I lived in an era where children were seen and not heard, and there was no reason to explain anything to a child. My mother told me we were going to Armidale to visit an aunt. But when we got to Armidale, we fronted up at the orphanage. I was told to go one way, my sisters went the other way, and that was a change in my life.
Were you allowed to socialise with your sisters once you were in this orphanage?
Only occasionally. So I wasn't able to access my sisters when I felt I needed to or wanted to. I could see them at meal times. The girls sat over one side of the dining room, the boys sat over the other side of the dining room. There was a real gender separation.
Well, how regimented was your life?
It was very regimented. It was a shock to me. All of a sudden I was getting up at 6:30 in the morning and then going to Mass every morning. Each afternoon there was another service, and then Fridays were benediction. And I found myself in the process of being prepped for conversion into Catholicism, and I had no idea what was going on.
What was the hygiene regime?
That was really scary and very shameful.
In what way?
It was a daily routine that the boys, after their playtime, would go up to be bathed, and the girls would come across to bath the boys. So there would be boys 10, 11, 12 years old lining up to have a bath. The bath it was up on the first floor, and the bath would have the water in it, and then you'd have 15, 20 boys lining up for a bath. As you moved towards the next to be bathed, you had to undress yourself, you leave your clothes on the floor, and then you were standing there naked waiting to be bathed. And then 14, 15-year-old girls would then bath you once you were in the bathtub.
But what did that do to your sense of yourself and your body and all those things?
For myself, it's something I'll never get over. That lives with me today. So I ran away. I did the only thing I knew that I could do. I took control of my own person and I ran away.
How often did you try and run away?
Yeah, I was a weekend runner. One particular occasion, I really did get away, and it was in the summertime, and it was very hot, and I'd been away the previous day, and it was halfway through the next day, and it was a hot day, and I I hadn't had any water. And I came across a little puddle. It had rained that night, and there was this little puddle of brown water on the ground, and I'm sitting there looking at that puddle of water, and I'm thinking, oh wow, I'm faced with this choice now. I know what's behind me. I don't know what's in front of me, but I have no water, and I'm trying to decide, do I go back or do I go forward? And and I had a drink of water out of that puddle, and I decided, well, I don't know what's in front of me, but I'd rather face that unknown than to go back to face what I already knew.
How were you caught?
Oh, the police called me. Well, the police called me, almost always did. And that was never a good result for me. They were quite abusive. They would give me a really good hiding because I'd been inconsiderate of the nuns, and I'd caused the nuns grief. And on a couple of occasions, I was black and blue from the dishing out of the punishment from the police.
What, for ingratitude?
For my ingratitude, for causing grief for the nuns. And then I'd go back, and then the nuns would punish me because I'd run away. So,
What was the cruelest punishment they came up with?
locking me in a room for days.
What kind of a room?
For the nuns, it was like a little closet. I would be locked in there and miss out on meals.
What would go through your mind when you're locked in a closet as a little boy?
In those early days, it was just scary. It was just plain, outright horrifying. And I'm still having some treatment as a direct result of those times today, but I have, I guess, dissociative disorder.
What does that mean?
It means I separate my mind from my body. I tend to place my mind in a more comfortable area, and I make up little stories in my mind to try and not allow my body to affect my mind.
What would your imagination transform that locked up space into?
Well, one of my favourite places to go was in a cave, and I established this little place where I had a force field, and I lived in this force field, and the only thing in that force field were all the animals that I liked, and no people. I never let people in. So that was a safe place for me. And I lived there for a long time as a child.
What did you know of the outside world from living in that kind of an environment?
Not a lot. When I left care, I was 19 years old when I left. And I hadn't learnt some of the very basic things about social life. I hadn't learnt how to have a conversation. I hadn't learnt how to act, I guess, with women, with girls. I hadn't learnt to relate to people. I'd learnt a lot of things while I was in care. I'd learnt to march, I'd learnt to fold my clothes, I learnt to scrub floors. What I didn't learn was how to go and get a job, how to look after the bills, how to find somewhere to live.
At the age of 14, you were sent to a remand centre called Minda, and after you'd been there for a month, you were brought to a psychiatrist's office because they figured something had gone horribly wrong with you.
Yeah, I was marched down to this office. I was standing there, and the person sitting at the other side of the desk asked me a few questions, and I had no idea what he was asking me, and I didn't answer. And the end result of that time in there, when I walked out, I was diagnosed as a sociopath. So
At 14?
At 14, yeah.
What had you said to him?
I hadn't responded to any of his questions.
What, you'd said nothing at all?
I'd said nothing at all. And he diagnosed me as a sociopath. And that was the New South Wales state psychiatrist.
Were you told that at the time?
No, not at the time. Well, it was a couple of weeks later when I went to court, and they read the report out in court. And the magistrate told me that I was diagnosed as a sociopath, and the magistrate was going to address that issue accordingly. And so I was sentenced into a period of detention and, well, they called it reformation.
What did it mean to you to be given the label sociopath at the age of 14?
It took me a while to understand what a sociopath was. And
You must have known it wasn't good.
well, I think I was proud of it at first because I had a label. I knew what it was. So in the early days, it was, oh yeah, I'm a sociopath. It's like, but I soon learned it takes a lot of energy to live the life of the sociopath, and I learned that sociopaths don't like people. They don't engage. They just do what they have to do, and that's it.
You're listening to Conversations with Richard Fidler. Hear more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app. Or go to abc.net.au/conversations.
We were saying just a moment ago how at the age of 14 you were brought in front of the New South Wales state psychiatrist. He asked you questions, you said nothing, and he diagnosed you as a sociopath.
That's correct, yes.
It seems to me like that fails the most elementary common sense test. Clearly what he had in front of him was a traumatised kid. I wonder why he couldn't see that.
I think it was important for a label to be designated to each child. I mean, I was in a remand centre at the time. He had to prepare reports for the court case. I don't think there was much time invested into actually getting any understanding of the reality of a lot of the children at that time.
At the age of 19, you were finally released, if that's the word, into society. What were you sent on your way with?
A nice set of new clothes and a couple of dollars, and a free trip to the train station.
Did they give you any advice?
Yes, they did. Stay out of jail.
Did you think you would stay out of jail?
I was scared. I didn't know. The rumours, you hear stories when you're that old and you're still in care, and a lot of kids ended up in jail. I was scared that I was going to be one of them. And I kind of made a promise to myself that I'd do whatever I had to do not to be one of them. And that promise turned out to be quite difficult to keep at times.
Did you have a lot of rage? Like I'm feeling quite, distressed and angry hearing about the way you were treated as a kid. I can't imagine the kind of level of rage you must have had. Did you understand what had happened to you in any sense?
No, I really didn't. I had no understanding. I mean, at that age, that was my lived experience. That was my life. I did not have a lot of comparison.
Did you think you deserved it in some way?
I really didn't think in that way. I was in survival mode. Especially once I was released out. One of the most difficult things that I was faced after I exited the care, while I was in care, I'd spent so much time not wanting to be where I was, always wanting to be somewhere else. And that was so ingrained into the way I was thinking that when I exited care, it was still in my psyche. No matter where I was, no matter where I went, no matter what I was doing, I never wanted to be where I was. And that created a lot of trouble for me. It made it very difficult for me to connect with community, to connect with other people, to establish any roots in any area. So I found myself constantly transient. The only jobs I could get were sessional work, the odd cleaning job, short-term work. It was very, very precarious.
Did you still have that cave you invented in your mind?
I did, yeah.
The cave with the force field around it and the animals inside it?
I did have that, yeah. And that was my retreat. I mean, one of the things about care, especially once I went into state care, is that, that closet that I spoke about at St Patrick's, that grew into a concrete cell, and I spent quite a bit of time in concrete cells in isolation because I wasn't always the easiest child. I'd get into a lot of trouble. I had this habit of telling people exactly what I thought. I didn't like being pushed around. They gave me this nickname. They called me Spider-Man.
Why do they call you Spider-Man?
Because I was so touchy and I'd jump. People would poke fun at me and I'd jump. And then, of course, as soon as they called me Spider-Man, I'd jump. So
Jump towards them or away from them?
I'd jump towards them.
So were people a bit scared of you then?
Oh, yeah. I'd jump straight for their throat.
Being a bit scary, was that a comfort in a funny way?
No, I didn't like it. I really didn't like who I was. It was it's very lonely. It's very, very lonely being angry. It's very, very lonely not knowing who you are.
You got married quite young. How long did that last for?
I did get married young. I took a hostage. It lasted for 3 weeks. And I guess that's the difference between a nice person and a good person. I was nice for a little while, trying to get my way. We got married and she found out I wasn't a good person. I was dangerous. I was angry. There was this anger living and functioning inside of me that was too big for her, and rightfully so. She left. Yeah.
And what happened after she left?
That hurt me a lot. I had in my head, you're married for life and it's supposed to be all this idyllic, little white picket fences and gardens, and it didn't work for me. So there was a lot of guilt, and I drank a lot of booze and became even more transient. I had nowhere to live. I was in and out of places like the Matthew Talbot, up and down the East Coast hitchhiking and sleeping on beaches, and
Where would you go to sleep?
Where I could find a safe place. I've slept underneath churches. I've slept in boiler rooms. As I've said, I've slept in homeless people's houses, homeless men's houses, I would call them. I've snuck onto verandas and slept. One of the most discouraging things I experienced was when local councils learnt the idea of watering their parks of a night. So at about 2 o'clock in the morning, the sprinklers would pop up and they'd start. That was very discouraging.
Yeah, I suppose when you sleep rough out in the open, you get all these defence mechanisms up and ready because someone can roll you or try and take stuff from you. So you've got to be ready to fight, wake up and fight in a second or something like that.
That's correct, yeah. And that's happened. I've woken up very beaten, bloody nose, black eyes, sore ribs. I've been in hospital a couple of times as a result of being bashed. Yep.
What brought the period of homelessness to an end when you were 29?
I made a resolution to myself that, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I've got to try and do something. So I went back to Tamworth and I really, really put all this energy into trying to get my life together, And at that time I applied for a couple of jobs and I didn't get any jobs. Nobody wanted to employ me, so I started this cleaning business. And my mate's cleaning service, I called it. And, a few months in and it was going really good. I was cleaning windows and offices, and I got myself a contract for the Tamworth Arcade. I had a couple of people working for me. We weren't paying tax. I wasn't quite that good. We weren't on the books or anything. It was like cash in hand. But it was working. Somebody had this nice townhouse and I moved in there, and they moved out, and I kept paying the rent and everything and looking after that. And I pretty much had an open door policy there. There was always food there. There were still quite a few homeless people and young people and that in Tamworth that come and had a feed. And that turned out to be a bad experience after a while, because one of my weaknesses is that I'm a man of my word. And I came home one day and the place was just in a terrible mess. It was just horrible, and I just sort of went right off. I did my nana, and I said to him, if this ever happens again, I'll burn the place down. A few weeks later, I went back and it was a mess again. And I had to keep my word. So I burnt the place down.
How did you do that?
Well, I went out to the truck and I got a couple of containers of fuel. I walked in and I told everyone they had about 2 minutes to get out. I just sloshed some fuel around, and when everyone was out and safe, I lit a match and threw the match in there.
Did you get burnt?
No, I didn't get burnt.
Were you charged with arson afterwards?
I was charged, yeah. They're quite serious charges. And I went through the process, and after a couple of years of mental health assessments, and my lawyers applied for, or my solicitors applied for a no bill on that, and that was granted on the grounds of temporary insanity. That's not a period of my life that I'm proud of, but it's a part of the result of mental health issues, and that's how they can manifest.
So you're off the hook with the arson charge, but nonetheless you didn't have a business anymore or a place to live. What did you do?
I was homeless again, yeah.
And this is when you went into the forest?
Roundabout. It was a little bit later than that, a couple of years later than that, yeah.
So you went into the forest and you were there for 10 years.
Yeah.
10 years. How did you change in that decade?
Some things happened to me while I was in the forest. And one of the things that I really did learn is that if you don't talk to someone over a long period of time, funny things start to happen in your head. And what happened to me was I started having conversations with entities that sometimes gave me some really good advice. Spoke to me about, it wasn't all my fault, but I needed to take responsibility for who I was. And
what form would they take?
No, they were druids and just ancient people.
Did you actually? Did you get to a point where were they just voices in your head, or would you actually be able to see them being present?
I could see them. Yep, my ancestors. I had conversations with my ancestors. These were all seeds that were planted in my mind for when I left the forest.
Were they kind?
Very kind indeed. And that's a part of that Catholicisation, and they helped me through that, like where I was living a sin, all of a sudden I was trying to survive the best way I knew how, and survival wasn't a sin.
It sounds to me like it's kind of like an expression of your best self, and it's interesting it took a pagan form, not a Christian or a Catholic form.
Yeah. I think that's important as well. I could trust it. And I never listened to music as a child because I was told it was bad for me. And I still have trouble listening to music today, but for different reasons. Today, music for me is more about the rustle of leaves or the song of a bird or the soft footprints of a lizard. Much more beautiful.
How's your physical health going over those 10 years, though?
Not good. Towards the end of that time in the forest, I became very ill, very, very ill. When I walked out of the forest, I was about 6.5 stone. I needed a walking stick to hold myself upright. My mental faculties were very fragile. Serious mental health issues. Psychosis had set in, delusion. I was not in a good way.
So that's when you decided to leave?
Yeah, it was more in my very courageous way. I thought, I'll give society another chance. Just one more chance. See if they can cut it this time.
Seems to me like you wanted to live, though, too. Did you make a decision to live?
Oh, I didn't make a decision to die. So, and
is there a difference? Is there a difference?
There is. I never wanted to lay down and just surrender. I think there's a fight inside of me that I have no control over. And that was reflected in that anger. Just after I left the forest, and I had some medical treatment, there were issues around there. I didn't have a Medicare card. I mean, I had a number somewhere, but I hadn't held one for so long, and the hospital wanted ID, and I didn't have any ID. I had no birth certificate or anything like that. I had to accumulate all that later, but, after I walked out of the hospital and I'm sitting on a park bench at the back of the hospital, and I was sitting there and I'm thinking to myself, well, I'm here and everything in the world that I own is here with me, which is nothing. And then it struck me, if I had just had one friend, one person that I could tell all my problems to, I'd be okay. And that was a horrible thought, because then I realised, well, here I am, I'm 45 years old and I don't have a friend in the world. I'm all alone and I have nothing. That was a really scary time for me. And I realised that all my life I'd been living in this fog and I couldn't see past my nose. And as this fog started to recede there, I became aware that, I was super vigilant, I was super angry, and I was waiting for the next fight. All my life I'd been waiting for the next fight. And as this fog receded even further, I could see all this devastation and destruction all around me. But I couldn't see anyone. But I was holding in my hands this great big double-edged sword. And the fog receded all the way to the horizon, and there was no one there. And then all of a sudden it struck me. I had created all this destruction, all this devastation. I had created fighting myself. All my life I'd been fighting myself. And I tried to throw that sword away, but I couldn't throw it away. I could not get rid of that sword, and I couldn't understand why at the time. I dropped to my knees and I thought, I don't want to fight anymore. I don't want to fight anymore. There was just peace. There was no desire to blame anyone. There was no desire to ask for justification or rationale. There was just peace. And I recall getting up from there and walking away, and I think even clearer than my time in the forest, I could see the leaf, I could see the grass, I could see the rocks.
What gave you the idea that you could study again?
Yeah. Well, I was sitting over on the riverbank and eating some chips, hot potato chips. And just across the road, there was a building site. And I was curious. I mean, I didn't have a lot to do then. I was in a really peaceful sort of a place, curious, like a child almost. And I went across and I said to these guys, what are you building? And they just said, it's a university. And I thought to myself, wow, I'd like to go to university one day. And over a period of a few months, I applied for a whole lot of jobs, and I still couldn't get a job. And I needed to sit down and I needed to ask myself, why couldn't I get a job? The simple answer was, I had nothing to offer. I had nothing that an employer would like, except how to brew
Green beer
and knock flying foxes out of a tree. And I was sitting there, I thought, well, if you don't know something, you can go and learn it. So I went to a TAFE and I asked them, I had a conversation with them. They said, oh, well, we've got this free computer course. I went and I did that course for 6 weeks and I learnt two things. Firstly, I don't like computers. But secondly, and importantly, I like to learn. I enjoyed that process of learning. So I went back to the TAFE and I said, well, what else can I do? And they put it to me that they had a tertiary preparation course. They said if you get through that, you pass that, depending on your grade, you can apply for a position at university. My ego got the better of me, and I thought I'd like to do that. So I did, and I went to the Southport TAFE.
Where were you living?
Yeah, I was still homeless. I was still pretty much homeless.
You're doing all this coursework while you were homeless?
Yeah.
Sleeping where?
On the beach, about 3 months on the beach, but I managed to secure some social welfare. So I was getting an income, which was, that was great. It really helped a lot. And I found that, when you don't live anywhere, you can actually save a little bit of money, especially if you don't eat too much. So I managed to get enough money together to go and buy an old Mitsubishi L300 van, and which meant I had to get a licence, which was an interesting process in itself. And then I was living in the van.
And so you finished your course.
Yeah.
You got into university.
Yeah.
And now you've finished a PhD. And now you are Dr. Gregory Smith.
I am, yes. Yeah. It's
Holy crap. I mean,
it's a bit scary.
you're now a teacher.
Yeah.
Given that you'd spent such a long time away from people, of course, now you have to interact with people all the time. Have you had to kind of learn all over again how to interact with people and with society from first principles?
I haven't had to learn all over again. I've only had to learn once. Yep. Because I approach society now completely different to the way I used to. I understand society completely different to the way I used to. Society is no longer my enemy. It's an organism that has the capacity for us all to be a part of. If we come to terms with who we are. And I think that's the answer. It's coming to terms with who I am. That process has provided me with some insight into the art of listening. I can hear other people, and I'm sure you're aware of this. It's not always the stories that people tell that are the most interesting. Sometimes it's just the actions or the little bits they leave out.
You're an academic in sociology to look at the kind of mechanics of society and how they work. Now that you have all this perspective and all this knowledge, and I know you've studied the plight of children who are in the situation you were in, what do you think now of that poor little boy that you were at the age of 10, thrust in that awful orphanage and treated so cruelly? Do you feel sorry for him? Can you have that detachment and distance from that boy?
That's a very powerful question. I would feel sorry for a boy in that position today. I don't feel sorry for myself, because today I understand that my experience, it actually drives my desire to be who I am today. I think if experience is about wealth, then I'm a very wealthy person. I understand what it's like to be hungry. I understand what it's like not to have somewhere to live. I understand what it's like to be locked in a cell for a week with only one meal a day. At the same time, I understand what it's like to be privileged with the opportunity to listen to other people tell their story. To be able, to be privileged with putting that story together, to making a PhD out of it, to making a valuable contribution to who we are today.
I'm taking a wild guess here in suspecting you're not living in a Mitsubishi van anymore.
That's all right.
Where are you living now? What kind of a lifestyle do you have now?
Well, no, I don't live in the Mitsubishi L300 anymore. I did quite well in my undergrad, and I was offered an opportunity to go on and do an honours degree, which I accepted. At the same time, I received a phone call from the Arts and Social Sciences at Southern Cross offering me some work, tutoring and marking. I accepted that. That was humbling in itself. I mean, if you think about it, the reason I went into study is because I couldn't get a job. I couldn't get an interview to get a job. And then here I am being offered work without actually going for an interview. I did my honours, and I exited with the first class honours, and I did my honours on St Patrick's Orphanage. It was called I'd Like to Tell You a Story, but I'm Not Sure If I Can. And it was about people that were afraid to tell their story because of their experiences. And I received quite a high grade for that honours. It was first class. I received an Australian Postgraduate Award scholarship, a stipended scholarship for that. Fantastic opportunity, I'm being paid to study all of a sudden, it's like. But what I was able to do during that process is accumulate enough money to actually go and buy myself 20 acres out in the bush.
Was that a dream of yours?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's what I dreamed of when I was living in the forest. I thought, what would it be like, in the forest, what would it be like to have somewhere that was comfortable, to be, you didn't have to go and repair the roof every day. You didn't have to go and find new foliage for your bed every day. You didn't. And now I have this beautiful place in the forest. Well, it's a different forest. I share it with a very beautiful woman. We're off the grid, totally off the grid. We have solar power, fresh eggs every day. It's I can sit on the veranda and I can just sit, and I don't have to worry.
And that piece of paper with the diagnosis, the erroneous diagnosis of you as a sociopath that was given to you at the age of 14, do you have that piece of paper now?
I do. I retrieved my records from docs a few years ago, and that particular piece of paper now hangs next to my degree on my office wall.
Well, if this isn't one of the most remarkable tales I've ever heard on this program, I don't know what is. What an amazing thing to speak to you about your extraordinary life, Gregory, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure.
That was my conversation with Gregory Smith, and since I spoke to him in 2016, he has lived what seems like another whole life. Gregory is now a tenured professor at Southern Cross University. His memoir, Out of the Forest, was published in 2017, and he recently published a second book called Better Than Happiness. He was awarded the Order of Australia in 2023, and he now lives in Orange with his partner and a 2-year-old son who keeps him on his toes. This conversation was recorded on the lands of the Turrbal and Jagera peoples. Producer was Michelle Ransom-Hughes, EP Pam O'Brien. I'm Richard Feidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Feidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.